and welcome to the Youth Work Plus podcast. Thanks for tuning in. We're joined by guest Dave Boden today. It's not his first time on the podcast. He works for Grace Foundation as his day job, but he's joined us today with his other hat on as author to promote a book that he's written and to have a more in-depth chat about Generation Alpha, which is what the book's about. I wonder if I can ask you first, how did you get into authoring books and how do you decide the themes and the content and what you write about?
Yeah, so I've only started really writing in depth in 2022. So I used to be a church leader and then work part-time in the schools work charity that I now lead full-time. When we finished our church leadership role, you suddenly realise that you had a little bit of extra time and all this creative energy. And somebody asked me this really interesting question because I used to speak a lot on Sunday mornings. And they said to me, are you a speaker who writes or a writer who speaks? And I realized when I thought about it, I thought, do you know what? I'm actually a writer who speaks. I actually love the writing. And some of the other projects that I've done in the past, like Clear Series and the video resource that I create for teenagers, that was the writing that I love doing. So I thought, actually, most of my adult life, I have been writing, but I would have never called myself a writer. Yeah. So once I'd figured that out, I decided to try actually writing books as well. And, you know, when people sort of say everybody has a book in them, most people just don't do it. And I think I'm one of those people that's not afraid to try. So I ended up starting the writing process, managed to get an agent. And as of today, Raising Gen Alpha will be my 4th book release, which I'm really proud of. And bizarrely, my wife has also started the journey at the same time, and she's released 4 books as well. So we've got 8 books between us since 2022. So if anybody wants to know how to write a book, come to our house for a cup of tea and we'll tell you. But in terms of the themes, it's always looking for like, where is the need? So the book that I wrote, my most successful book was called Like or Follow, What Every Teenager Needs to Decide About Jesus. And it was actually a book for teenagers to help kids who are exploring faith take those first steps towards Christ. And the reason I wrote that was I wanted that resource myself. I was so desperate for a resource for teenagers who don't have any faith background and actually wanted to take those first steps without any religious language and sort of like old-fashioned style. So in the end, it came out of just thinking, well, if this doesn't exist, why don't I try and write it? And everything it's done has been to try to solve real-world problems that I'm facing myself or that I'm encountering through my day job, which is leading Grace Foundation.
Yeah, amazing. So tell us a little bit then about what the new book is about and what inspired it and why that came about.
Yeah, so everybody's talking about Gen Z at the moment, right? The Quiet Revival, which is fantastic, and I'm sure we'll touch on that later. But Gen Alpha as a generation is already here. And in fact, it's already finished. And I became very interested in trying to understand what is going on for the next generation. I've realized everything that I do, if you sort of cut me through and through, I want to be able to empower the next generation. The writing came out of that, whatever else it is that I do, I want it to be part of that story. So I think it's very easy as an adult to think that you know what's going on for the next generation, but actually very quickly become very far removed from it. And I remember talking to my teenage daughter. I've got 4 children, but my youngest, Sienna, she was 12 years old at the time. So she's Gen Alpha kid. And I was in the car and I said, why do you think, Sienna, older people don't understand the next generation? And she just came out blunt and said, Dad, it's simple as this. You did not grow up in the same world as us. And that really floored me. And I thought, you know what, it's right, that the world has changed. Even as somebody who's done youth work for 20 years, it's so easy to think, I know what's going on for youngsters. I talk to teenagers all the time, but do I really know what's going on? And I think if I kind of extrapolate that wider for people that aren't involved in what you and me are involved in, Becky, like youth work, when you think about parents and church leaders and people that are engaging with the next generation, I think to be able to understand what's going on for the next generation helps us to love them better and lead them better. And often a lot of the resources that I read around young people are often like, here's how you can fix them. Here's how you can evangelize to them. Here's how you can reach them, as if there's some sort of product on a shelf over here. So I became really interested and fascinated in what's really going on for Generation Alpha. Why don't I know enough about Generation Alpha, even though it's nearly finished? Why is the church not talking about Generation Alpha? And at the same time as this, a friend of mine who's a senior leader in secondary education, he came to me and he said, I began to talk a bit about Gen Alpha with him, his vice principal, and he said, I need you to come and talk to 600 of my leaders in my school in Birmingham, because they are freaking out about what's going on with all the 12-year-olds, and they need to know what's happening so that they can prepare now for what's coming. And I thought, what an amazing, insightful leadership that they actually were looking ahead to try to prepare. And then I thought, well, what about the church? Like, how are we preparing for what's going on with Gen Alpha? How are we sort of getting ourselves ready for what is already amongst our midst? How are we adapting and changing? If this institution, education, can change, maybe we should too. So through the course of preparing that, the research behind that for this very first keynote speech I did, I came up with the Gen Alpha framework, which the book is based off.
Yeah, amazing. Tell us a little bit then about Generation Alpha, what you learned. How do they differ from the previous generations, and what sort of sets them apart?
Yeah, so Gen Alpha, there's a bit of debate on it when you talk about generational lenses, but McCrindle research, they say that anybody born from 2010 to 2024 is known as a Gen Alpha kid. So you've got Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, and then Gen Alpha. I am a millennial, so like a Gen Y, and one of the things about generational lenses, you try not to stereotype, but you're trying to recognize that where you were born and when you were born does make a big difference to how you see the world. In the book, I begin to unpack the research that this is the first generation born fully into the 21st century. When they were born has made a huge difference in the way they see the world. So even with technology, you know, I can remember dial-up internet. I can remember first getting broadband and thinking it was amazing. And I can remember going to a Blockbuster video on a Friday night and choosing the video and being desperate for the right video to be there, and also having to rewind it when I sent it back. So my sort of childhood and cultural experience was shaped by the technology and the milestones that affected me. So then we've got this next generation, Gen Alpha, who I absolutely love and think are amazing. And one of the ways I try to express and understand them was by this framework, which in essence is, I like acronyms, is when you look at everything together, number one, they are anxious-minded. So we've got the most anxious-minded generation that ever existed. 1 in 4 meeting the criteria for a serious mental health issue, which is, you know, it's not a great stat, but it's a reality. So it's 5 kids in every classroom, you know, and we can unpack all of this. So they're anxious-minded. They're also leading influencers. So they want to make a difference in the world. 2/3 of Gen Alpha kids want to buy from brands that make a difference. But unlike Gen Z, who were saying, we're going to do it, a lot of these guys are now pointing the finger back at big business and institutions and saying, you wrecked this, you need to fix it, which is one of the really interesting things that's coming through. They have a heart for social justice, but they're also very conflicted. So, you know, whenever you read about this generation or talk to teenagers and young people, you think, wow, these are guys are really going to make a difference. But then you go to school playground, right? And you still see that as inclusive as this generation are, we still have all the bullying and the challenges, basically, if not more than ever. So they're caring but conflicted. But the biggest thing in that leading influencers is that they want to be participators and not consumers, which I can't stress that message enough when we come to the work that we do with young people, is they don't want things done to them. They want things done with them. And then the next part of the acronym is pandemic impacted. So we've got 84% of parents believe that COVID is going to have a lasting impact on this generation. And one of the things that I found interesting is that we've maybe not talked enough about Gen Alpha, but also we've not really talked about COVID, right? Like COVID seemed to be this thing that happened. And then us as adults, we all try to move on. But in the same way that 9/11 was a cultural milestone for millennials, the pandemic has absolutely been a major driver. It was like an earthquake, and we're still living in the aftershocks of it. And there's a lot of disparity in young people and Generation Alpha of whether or not that was a good experience or a challenging experience. But nevertheless, it's hugely impacted life before COVID and life after. And I guess as we're talking about this, Becky, a lot of things we could say, we as adults, we feel the same, right? So then the next H is hyperconnected. So Gen Alpha leading that 100% digital world. whereas Gen X sort of like put their toe into the digital world. And then as we've gone progressively more into it, Gen Alpha were born swimming in the sea of screens and hyperconnectivity. And then the last part of the acronym is AI shaped linked hyperconnectivity. So we have this generation growing up in a world of AI, and to think that it's not affecting us is like burying your head in the digital sand, right? It's just 65% of Gen Alpha kids are going to work in jobs that don't even exist yet. That's kind of how much the world is changing. Probably has changed already and will change for Gen Alpha. So that's the framework really in a nutshell, and some of those distinctives of Gen Alpha in many ways like Gen Z, the younger siblings of them, but more kind of accented, more kind of entered into that world. Once I'd sort of figured out that this is the framework and lens and the research that I found behind it, that's really what's been able to help me begin to talk about how can we help parents understand what's going on in their world, and youth leaders and educators as well.
What's the biggest lesson you think you've learned about Gen Alpha?
I think, number one, I feel very hopeful about Generation Alpha. Even though actually some of the characteristics I've talked about, anxious-minded, pandemic impacted, is quite negative. I think there's never been a generation that is more curious than Faith, and all the stats that you read show that. When we talk about this kind of Gen Z rise in interest in faith, then look at their younger siblings, that they're sort of starting to swim in that culture as well. They're full of energy, humor, creativity. And I think what I love about them is this idea that they want to take part and they want to make a difference. So when I grew up, I remember MTV, right? And MTV was this thing that was this big deal where it's very professional and it was very sort of curated by the celebrities, and somebody decided like what music was going to be best and what to watch, and everybody tuned in and loved it. And then in the early 2000s, MTV had the chance to buy YouTube. I tell this story in the book, which you probably remember. And they looked at YouTube and they were like, there's this scrappy kind of, there's no celebrities on it. It's not polished. It's not professional. It's produced by the user. Why would anybody want that? And then last year in April, I was in Milan and I went to a museum. And can you believe what I saw in the museum? I saw the MTV logo as like a relic of the past. And MTV missed the boat. They thought that they could curate it for everybody. They didn't realize that the coming generation wanted to be producers, not just consumers. And I think the biggest thing I love about Gen Alpha is that they want to take part in it. They want to be part of the solution. They want to get involved. And that gives me great hope. That gives me great hope for the church, and it gives me great hope for the next generation. I've got a Gen Alpha daughter myself who, gosh, like some of what she's seeing in her school right now in terms of evangelism and faith and reaching her friends for Jesus. And then she did her very first preach, 15 years old. We took her to Manchester. She did a 20-minute talk on how to reach your friends for Jesus that had 60 people in the room. You could hear a pin drop. And then she took live Q&A at the end of it. This is a girl that's never done this in public, holding the room with pastoral depth of insight. Wow. That me as an adult, I would have found it hard to answer some of the questions. Kids asking questions like, very seriously, like, oh, hang on a minute. Like, how can I reach my friends when I'm struggling in my faith? That's a tough question, right? So the 15-year-old at the front of this room full of 60 people being asked by other 15-year-olds, how do we do this thing? So they want to know and they want to be involved. And that's what I love about Gen Alpha. And that's what I think makes me most hopeful.
Yeah.
What about you, Becky? What do you love about Gen Alpha?
I still struggle to understand them a bit, I think. I think every generation of young people has been, in a lot of ways, the same, but in a lot of ways different. They're all young people, and yes, we can relate because we've also been young, but also it's that whole thing of, but we haven't been young when they've been young, and we don't quite see the world with the same perspective as them. Even little things that my daughter comes out with. So she was born in 2022, and she's known how to use an iPad since she was like one, maybe even younger than one. So she'll just pick up a device now and like swipe away on it, and that's exactly what she's doing.
Yeah.
It's really interesting what you say about the content as well, because I'll try and put on like CBeebies for her or one of the other kids' channels, and she's like, "No, Mum, I want to watch kids' YouTube."
Yeah.
And that's the content that she wants, like the unpolished.
Yeah, and one of the crazy stats that I figured out, the top 9 YouTube channels in the world, 3 of them are being produced by Gen Alpha kids. So these are like 10 and 11-year-olds who are like in the top 3 in the world, like they're rivaling Mr. Beast with their content. Or there's that whole thing of them wanting to watch other people watch things. So it's like Gogglebox, but for gaming, it's that sort of thing. And again, it just shows that whole like unpolished nature of it. But also, like with your daughter, some of the world she's growing up in now, because it's so immersive. One of the crazy stats that I heard was that 9 out of 10 teachers report that there's a child in their classroom in primary school doesn't know how to use a book. Now, when I say use, I don't mean read, I mean use. So they're basically tapping on the book and they're swiping the book. And I'm like, how is that not having an impact on the way that we see the world?
Yeah.
So these kids are surrounded by screens and they're being shaped by social media and I say in the book, discipled by data. Now, the good news is that you as a parent in the middle of this, and I've started to talk to a lot of parents just from doing this book, is that all the research says that parents are still the number one influence in a child's life. So you still have a voice in the midst of the algorithm, which is so fantastic to know, isn't it? And again, so hopeful that there's this thing that God's done that basically in the Psalm says that one generation will tell of God's story to the next. So the way the gospel gets passed down through the generations is actually through storytelling from one generation to the next. So if I wanted to divide that, if I wanted to be like clever and disrupt it, what would I do? I would try to divide the generations. I would get them fighting against each other. I would get them saying that my generation's better than your generation. You don't understand it. I would try to divide it, because what that then does is it disrupts the story of God being told to the next generation, which is a massive thing, right? But actually us as parents and educators and youth workers and people working with the next generation, we are doing that golden thread of history, which is passing on the story of God to the next generation. And, and the good thing is that story is still so relevant for their generation too.
Yeah, I do find it really interesting as well, the Generation Alpha perspective on things, and Youthscape are bringing that out a little bit in some of their research, aren't they, in terms of like how curious they are, but also what some of their perceptions of Jesus are. And some of them you just think like, whoa, how did they get that from that? Like they're reading the same Bible stories, but they're picking up on stuff that's totally different than what we would have got, because their perspective is just different.
Yeah. So, for example, with the exercise they do with the woman at the well, and then they read that story and say to the young people, "What do you think? This is a great example." And a teenager comes out and says, "Jesus is mansplaining." To a woman, right? You've probably read that in the research. But I think that's a great example of how there's a generational lens. So it's almost like all of us, we've got our generational glasses on. And we can't help but look at it through that lens. So for those of us who are wanting to tell the story of God to the next generation, the story doesn't change, but the means and the method and the framing of it does. So it's a bit like evangelism, like when we look at evangelizing anybody right now or speaking to them about telling the story of Jesus, we've got to understand their starting point and not ours, which is one of the big things that I are trying to communicate across in the book, is to say, look, parents, educators, like we've got to put ourselves in their shoes, because if we don't, we're going to think we're talking, but it's going to be like, sorry to talk about the pandemic again, but do you remember in the pandemic when somebody would talk and they would passionately be communicating, but then everybody else in the room would go, "You're on mute." Do you remember? Yeah. And the person talking didn't realize they were on mute until everybody else pointed it out to them. But what's happening with this next generation is that we're often on mute, but nobody's bothering to say, "We don't understand a word you're saying." Young people are just saying, "That's just not relevant for my life," and switching off straight away. Which is, it's a challenge, right? It's why this stuff is so important to talk about. And also to talk to teenagers as well. It's so important to talk to young people like Youthscape have done and say, what does this look like for you? Because actually some of those preconceptions or stereotyping that they're coming with, like when we say the word church, we see one thing, but they see something very, very different, and we've got to do that language barrier overcoming, and we need a translator. Thank God we've got Jesus, right?
Have you got like any tips or like ways you think that parents and leaders can start to try and understand where Gen Alpha is coming from when we're trying to do parenting with them and trying to do youth and kids work with them?
Yes, I was talking with a bunch of parents in our church last Friday, and we're starting to unpack this idea of understanding Gen Alpha, and it was really interesting because as we started to talk about anxious-minded, I thought we'd be able to skip through that one and get on to the next one. But I think we have to recognise that for young people, anxiety is such a big driver for what's going on for them. And the reality is it's the same for us as parents too. So a lot of parents are incredibly worried about what's going on with the next generation. So first thing to say is find out what's going on, talk to them, listen without, fear, listen without judgment. And it's almost like that thing of like put on your own gas mask before you can help someone else. So I think there's a degree to which, even as we're unpacking this framework with parents in the last week, it's like if we're going to talk to kids about being pandemic impacted, we've got to look at ourselves first. How did that impact us? And maybe we need to do a bit of unpacking there. So I think the first thing is look at what's going on for you. Be prepared to ask really good questions and become curious, not furious about what's going on. We can be very quick to judge. So like we've had a laugh about, like I still can't get my head around kids watching other people game. It just doesn't make my sense. Like it doesn't make any sense to me. But then I've asked young people why, and they give me some very interesting reasons. And then I remember that when I was a teenager, I used to buy magazines to get cheat codes to try to get to the next level and do that. But it's this generation's version of that.
Yeah.
So I think become very curious about what's going on. I think deal with your own anxiety first, put your own gas mask on. And I think when it comes to then helping unpack that with young people, it's about asking good questions. It's about recognizing that there may be some forces, external and internal, that are driving this generation that mean that we maybe need to take a step back and a bit of a grace pause and say, how can we listen better? How can we learn better? How can we start to then enter their world? And then when you enter their world, we can start to help and lead them and love them through it. So, for example, with the anxious-minded, we've got to remind kids that how you can renew the mind. We've got to remind kids that the emotions are very much attached to what's going on in your body. So they've got to move their bodies, and we have to remind people that the spirit, what we feed in our spirits, like garbage in, garbage out. What we're feeding our young people, that prayer and spiritual development is so key to tackling those anxious thoughts. When it comes to being a leading influencer, we've got to help our kids basically say, what is it that you care about in the world, and how can we make a real difference? When we talk about being an influencer, people default to, oh, that means what's going on, being a YouTuber, right? Or being an Instagrammer. No, being an influencer is the impact and difference you can make for those around you every day. So having those conversations with young people, so what do you care about? And what one small thing can you do to make a difference for somebody today? And then when you've got that relationship of trust, maybe challenging some of those things of like, well, you say you're inclusive and caring about everybody, but what about that text that you sent? What about when you walked by that kid that was bullied in school? How can we help our kids become, those that act justly, love mercy, and also walk humbly? So don't do it with their phones on all the time so that they're trying to say they want to be seen and heard when they're doing it, right? And these come down to identity issues with young people. Is that the three biggest questions every Gen Alpha kid and every teenager is asking is, who am I? That's the identity question. What am I here for? That's the purpose question. Where do I belong? It's the community question. And I think as parents and those involved in youth ministry, we have to constantly answer those questions for young people to create the kind of culture and environment that makes them want to be IRL, makes them want to be in real life and not just disappear into hyperconnectivity. Because everybody's trying to answer these questions all the time. So what difference do we make to those? How are we helping bring security for them? So when it comes to that kind of pandemic impacted nature, it's helping kids understand and process to become resilient, and the hyperconnected AI is that thinking critically, choosing wisely, and actually building that real world connection. And I think this is why youth workers, it's so important, is that we have in-person connection, because we have to create in-person opportunities that help foster that sense of community and belonging. And, we can offer something that a chatbot never can. And we have to remind young people, and I think explicitly tell them, you do realize that the algorithm does not know you. I said to someone the other day, the algorithm knows what shopping preferences are. It knows what I search for on the internet, but it doesn't know how bad I am at washing up. My wife knows that because she knows me in real life. And we have to help young people understand that these in-person, authentic relational experiences are offering young people way more than a chatbot ever can. And there's some big dangers out there, big challenges and opportunities for us in the midst of it. It comes to AI world. In 2024, Harvard did a review study and said the number one reason for ChatGPT use was productivity. They did it again in 2025. And do you know what the number one use of it was? Relationship and connection. Yeah. So there's a shift happening in our use of online tools as adults that is reflected in what's going on for the next generation. So if we don't work really hard to build those authentic, genuine, curious, not furious, non-anxious presence in young people's lives connections, then they are going to struggle. They're going to struggle to navigate and think critically about what's going on. Like you and I know that we're having this conversation now and it's real, but we might tune into a podcast online when you're scrolling next week and realize that there's two podcasters talking that aren't even real. And those podcasters have been created by AI using notebook LLM and just off the back of somebody's coding, or vibe coding as they call it nowadays. So I think to help young people understand that there's a real world worth living in and occupying, so they can then navigate through the dangers and opportunities of what's going on online.
Yeah. Really helpful. Have you got any particular ministry highlights or good news stories that are linked in with Gen Alpha?
Yeah, so I mentioned about my daughter getting involved, and I had an experience recently in one of our schools where they said to me, Dave, will you come and see the Christian Union? Because I was there for a meeting. I said, yeah, I'll come to the Christian Union, thinking maybe there's going to be 5 kids in a room or something like that. And I walked in this room. I thought I was in the wrong place. There was 30 kids rammed into this tiny room, literally sat everywhere. And I'm looking around and I'm like, where are the adults? And the adults were sat in the corner. And then this teenage lad who's not a Christian piped up and said, hello, everyone. I'm going to lead the Christian Union today. Today, we're going to look at the topic of Jesus and loving others. And he read a scripture. And then his Christian friend, who was there co-leading with him, said, right, now let's discuss that in groups. So what does it mean to love other people? So for 20 minutes, they're discussing what it means to love other people. And then let's get some feedback. And this Gen Alpha lad puts his hand up and says, to be honest, if we're really going to put what Jesus says into practice, then we're going to have to start loving our teachers as well, aren't we? And processing what Jesus is saying from the scripture. And they're all going, oh, yeah, we're going to have to change. We're going to have to change, aren't we? And then the non-Christian lad says, well, when it comes to love, I just want to say that I've never experienced the love of anyone like I feel when I'm in this room with you. And then they're all clapping him and cheering. I'm in the corner and I'm trying not to choke up because these kids are engaging. Yeah. They're basically discipling each other. And then at the end of it, they all left. And I looked at the adults and I realized that no adult spoke for 30 minutes. Mm-hmm. And I guess when you say what encourages me about Gen Alpha and it highlights, for me it's that. For me it's that. It's that my teenagers, they get together to do Bible study in the house, and if an adult interrupted them, it would kill the vibe. And often I hear my 15-year-old worshipping with her friend on the guitar in her bedroom. whilst facing all the same anxiety and
Yeah.
challenges of school and all the stuff. It's not perfect by any means, but the ministry highlight for me is that this generation have so much in them, and how do we as those around them obviously understand them, but then also release them and not get in the way. Like, honestly, if I'd have tried to shut down that Christian Union or even contribute, it would have killed it. And that took a lot of wisdom from the guys and a bit of humility for me to shut up, because I had nothing to do with it. That was, you could say it was them, you could say it was God, you could say this quiet revival, whatever you want to call it. That's what I get excited about in terms of the next generation. That's a ministry highlight for me.
Yeah. Love that. Have you got a question for me?
I've got a question for you, Becky.
Go on then.
I know I've already asked you one, which I probably shouldn't have, but
No, it's all right.
What would you say to your Gen Alpha? If you were a Gen Alpha kid today, right? So if you were sort of 12-year-old girl, looking back, what would you say to your Gen Alpha self today?
I think, to set some context, I think I was a very insecure, anxious young person, and it definitely took me a long time, like all of the teenage years, to build up that confidence and to get out my shell. And I was part of a Christian youth group, but I didn't actually become a Christian until I was 19. So I kind of knew of God, but the penny didn't drop for me until 19. So yeah, I remember feeling like just very unloved by everybody, and just like I didn't matter in the world. And I think lots of young people feel like that now. And so I resonate with that, and definitely resonate with that anxious mindedness of Gen Alpha. So I'd say to my 12, 13-year-old self, like, have more confidence, like you are loved and you are worthy of all of that. And I think if I'd heard that and received it, and like that had sunk into me as a 12-year-old, I think it would have been a lot easier to deal with all the challenges of being a young person and being a teenager, and trying to come to terms with like what faith meant for me in my own life. But having said that, like, I definitely, like, when I became a Christian when I was 19, there was an overnight transformation of my heart and mind that like definitely swept a lot of that away. But yeah, if the penny had dropped sooner, I think it would have saved a lot of heartache for my little 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 and 18-year-old me.
And would the penny dropping be like just realizing like identity, do you think, or like who you are?
Yeah, definitely identity. I think I compared myself to other young people a lot and just thought I was less than all of them. I don't even know why. When I look back now, there's no reason or rhyme to it at all. And I look back at photos of me and I know how I felt then, but I can't explain why that was. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that's probably the experience of so many teenagers, isn't it? Whatever generation you are. And actually, it's a really good reminder that all these cultural shifts and changes are happening in the midst of the roller coaster of just the teenage years. It's just hard, isn't it? At 10 years old, I used to live in Yorkshire, moved to Leicester. So between 10 and 14 was incredibly difficult for me. And in fact, the reason why I do what I do now is because in some ways I'm trying to help the younger version of myself, because I actually, now I would call it, I experienced like loss and grief of like my whole world was in Yorkshire. We moved house for nice reasons because of my dad's job, lost all my friends, lost my community, lost my sense of identity. So that was a really tough season for me. And now I know what it was. I was grieving. But I wish that I had somebody really be able to help me communicate that at the time. But what was interesting was what got me out of the hole eventually was people walking alongside me in my teenage years, and then church and finding that identity and belonging through church and Jesus. So then once you've been through that, you're like, man, we work with 17,500 young people every single day, and I can relate to so many of them because I was a school refuser. I used to sit in the corner at the age of 12 years old and had something called, remember this is like over 30 years ago, Dave's Depression Corner. And I used to use mental health language back then, which looking back now, I can't believe it, because I don't even know how I knew that word, because people didn't talk about mental health, did they, back then?
No.
Like 30, so this would have been 35 years ago. and I would call it Dave's Depression Corner. And I can remember sitting on my own. So walking through that and what God did in my life and setting me free from all that, like then now I'm doing what I'm doing because of that, really. Probably went a bit too deep there, but it's that thing, isn't it, of then sharing, like these teenagers that are coming through today, they're having their own version of what we've been through, and it's important.
And that's what I mean. There's a lot of similarities between being a young person today and being a young person when we were young, because it's the same, as we've said, identity challenges. What's my purpose here? What am I here for? Where can I find community and find a place where I can fit in? Those are all things that we dealt with
Yeah.
and every generation deals with, but we just see all those things through a slightly different lens, as we've already said.
Yeah, and then the answers that we're giving for them through technology and the opportunity, the open book to be able to answer those questions in an unhealthy way, so like people finding belonging in, I don't know, like unhealthy community groups online, for example, like sense of finding your identity by the way that you look and display yourself through likes and follows and highlights, finding your purpose in only wanting to kind of absolutely living for the next online trend and then being the popular one online, all those kind of things. The opportunities that technology has opened up are great and positive, but also very challenging as well. Every time I talk about it, I get so compassionate for the next generation, don't you?
Yeah, well, I was going to say we could go off on a massive tangent here about the manosphere.
Absolutely.
Obviously, there's so much that young people can tune into in terms of content that's out there that isn't helpful, and how do we help them in the midst of that?
But actually having that framework of like identity, purpose and belonging really does help, even with things like the manosphere and what's going on out there, because people are trying to find answers to those questions. Our thing is, how do we offer a better in-person alternative and help them navigate with wisdom what's going on online using the influence that God has given us?
Yeah, definitely. What are your thoughts on what's being named the Quiet Revival? Are you seeing a shift in young people and young adults coming to faith and coming to churches? And do you think it's the start of something bigger?
Okay, so we've mentioned the Quiet Revival a couple of times, haven't we? I think there's definitely something has shifted, whatever you call it, and however you sort of define it, in terms of church attendance and statistics and all that side of it.
Yeah.
If you think about deconstruction, there was certainly millennials and a lot of kind of Gen X, Gen Y, even some of the Gen Z, there was a big deconstruction journey that went on where people sort of came away from the faith and were no longer interested in it. What's happened with Gen Alpha is that I always describe it like freshly kind of laid snow where there's nothing there, so every footprint they put of spirituality seems to be new to them. So we've come full circle, and now when I talk to young people today, there isn't the knowledge and understanding that the previous generation had, which means that we've got to completely change our approach to how we do ministry, but B, it gives us a tremendous opportunity to help capitalize on that stirring of spiritual curiosity. Although, again, we have to be careful that we don't align spiritual curiosity with the gospel. That's what the critics would say. They say, just because they're spiritually curious generation doesn't mean that they're choosing to understand who Jesus is and accepting them as their Lord and Savior and choosing to follow him with their whole lives and lay their lives down before him. So it's that kind of evangelism and discipleship journey. So I think that there's still a bit of work to be done around shifting people's mindsets to just because they're spiritually curious doesn't mean they want to follow Jesus. But I think that what we're seeing is that rise in spiritual curiosity, which can lead to discipleship opportunities if the church are willing to put themselves in the next generation's shoes and start where they are. So my first book was called Parallel Faith, and it was basically walking alongside others on their journey to Christ. And in essence, it was about, like, the Engel scale and the kind of like scale of evangelism. So it's this idea that people move from not interested to becoming spiritually curious, to actually becoming a believer, to growing as a disciple and then becoming a disciple maker. That's the journey of faith that all of us are on. And actually all of us are somewhere. So you're either not interested, or you're spiritually curious, or you just become a Christian, or you're growing in faith. and then maybe get to a point where you start to help others find and become a disciple maker too. So to recognize that we're on this journey is so key for the quiet revival, because we can default often to saying, well, there's more people coming to church. To some extent, you could say, so what? So I know I could give you the stats of certain nations where 85% of people in that nation go to church, 85%. And we're talking about the shift from 4 to 16, particularly amongst young men, right? So if I was to say the statistic is 85%, are they in revival? Well, the question then is, actually what then is going on in people's lives? How are we translating religious activity into authentic discipleship? And how are people becoming more like Jesus? So the goal of discipleship is to become more like Jesus, not to become more churched, right? So if the goal of discipleship is to become more like Jesus, and then as we become like Jesus, we begin to say, God, your kingdom come, your will be done. So the purpose on earth is to fulfill God's purpose, not our own, which is brilliant for Gen Alpha, because there's this big thing called the kingdom of God they can get involved in, right? That was before them and it'll be here after them as well. Is how do we help people understand that they have to follow Jesus and they have to live like Jesus so that the world can become and reflect a bit more of the kingdom of God? I think that's the most interesting stuff in all of this stuff is that happening? We're on the edge of it, I think. I think we've got the seeds of it. If the church, I think renewal has to come before revival. So I think it'd be better to be talking about a quiet renewal or a loud renewal before we talk about a quiet revival, because there's still so many in the church who don't understand what I've just said about the goal of discipleship. They still think it's to be a nice person to be church. Sorry to say that. They don't understand that the whole purpose and plan of God is for people to become more like Christ, and to follow him. So actually, the end game is Christ-likeness, not better religious activity. And I think I would love to see the church become more excited about that, as well as church attendance. But church is a big part of that. I was a church leader. I'm part of a local church. And actually, church has to make room for Gen Alpha. And church has to make room for every generation, right? And that doesn't mean change it all and install services or Lego seats everywhere so they can make and build. It's not any of that stuff. It's literally about becoming more open to understanding the differences and more connected as generations. And the beautiful thing about that is you can do that in any budget, right?
Yeah. How do you think churches and youth workers and kids workers can engage more boldly?
Yeah. I think that it'd be really interesting to reflect on how we understand, and you'd agree with me, Becky, youth and children's work in the church. So what is it for? Is it for babysitting so that the adults can have their religious activity, or is it for spiritual formation? If it's about spiritual formation of the next generation, how is that the activity that we're doing on a Sunday morning or a holistic church picture on and offline, how are we building something that focuses more on formation rather than just programs? I think that at their best, family ministry in church is interconnected, it's intergenerational. It's not just about Gen Alpha, it's about every generation. And seeks to create opportunities for the old to connect with the young, to not be on trend, but to be on relationship and to create community. At their best, we're teaching kids scripture, and not just like Bible verses independently, not just stories independently, but what is a biblical worldview? What does it mean to look like a world through the lens of the Bible? What does it look like to know the big story of God? Which is, again, there's loads of research on this, and and I'm sure you've had people talk on the podcast before about Bible engagement is so key for every generation. So I think that at the best you do it. At the worst, what we're doing is providing a babysitting club of disconnected, disjointed, not joined up thinking for kids to do stuff until they're old enough to enter adult activities. And by the time they enter adult-based activities, more often than not, they've disengaged because they were never engaged in the first place. And one of the big dangers is that especially in the, I think for Gen Alpha, is going to be the light and shade of hype and emotion and energy, and kids work is fantastic and fun and youth work is amazing. I'm not knocking that. You need that because it needs to be exciting and engaging. But the light and shade is then where do we find those points for reflection and engagement? And I've got to say, like, our church does this incredibly well. I'm not involved in the youth ministry, but my kids attend it, and they do a program which involves the big events of worship, but then also they're meeting in small groups as well. And they're talking about real issues, and they're engaging with the Bible in a real way. And they treat it all the same. They don't say one's better than the other. They create an effective diet and rhythm. So I think the churches have got to really ask themselves, what is our vision for the next generation? Going back to what my friend said when he came and said, all these post-16 leaders are freaking out about what's going on with the next generation, so they want to be able to lead them better. Are we preparing children effectively for the future, or are we preparing them for a world that no longer exists?
Yeah.
These are big questions, aren't they? And I think if we're honest, what's happening is often in churches, we perpetuate a model which may have worked 3 generations ago, didn't even work 2 generations ago, and doesn't connect now. So we've got to really look at what is the rhythm of spiritual formation, of relationship and engagement with the next generation, because these kids deserve more than just, a kind of a sticky plaster of faith before they can kind of figure it out themselves, because they'll be gone. They'll be gone because the church can never offer the same entertainment value as your Netflix account. It's never going to do it. So it has to fight in a different way. It has to fight on that identity, purpose, belonging, relationship question. And when it does, oh boy, we're going to see some amazing things happen.
Yeah. Which it reminds me of the way church and teaching in general, the way we teach in schools. The traditional model is to teach you something. I'm going to talk for ages and you're going to sit and listen, and that's how you're going to learn. That's how traditionally we've done church, and traditionally teachers have taught in classrooms. And that needs to change, not just because people don't learn successfully in that way.
Yeah.
And they haven't done, I don't think, even for us as millennials, we didn't all learn in that way. No. I know I definitely didn't. That's not the best way that I learn. But, as we're understanding generations better, how do we tweak and change some of those traditional models to engage better with the newer generations?
I think, and a key question to ask, which is, I'm going to bring in an education question now. So is the difference between teaching and learning. So the church is full of teaching, but discipleship is about learning.
Yeah.
So, and actually it's about learning that leads to life change. So Jesus said, if anybody hears my words and puts them into practice, then you're like somebody who builds a house upon a rock. So the implied, like page 1 for Jesus, like 101 is, you will hear my teaching and you will put it into practice. Page 1 for many churches is, you will hear teaching.
Yeah.
And the more people we have to hear that teaching, our success criteria is met. So we're really, really happy. And that's a big shift. So I would say that for any ministry listening or anybody, simply ask that question, like, all our teaching, what are people learning? And then an Ofsted question that's asked all the time, we've had to do it in Grace Foundation, is, how do you know? How do you know that they're learning? And again, I can guarantee you that many, many churches don't have an answer for that question. So I think there has to be some real big questions. So this is not about doing church in a radically different way. This is about how are the touch points that we have repurposed around discipleship for every generation. And when you do that, it has a huge impact on Gen Alpha, because then everybody's learning together, right?
Yeah.
And Jesus wants this. When Jesus cleared the temple, he got rid of all the religious stuff, right, in there. And it's one of the times he got really, really angry, cleared it all out. And what happened when he did that? He made room for the children to come in. So surely that in the heart of Christ, that God is a multi-generational God. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jesus is multi-generational in all he is, and he wants the next generation to find him. So I think we've got to ask some really tough questions, right, about how we kind of build church communities that are focused more around learning for every generation.
Yeah, and I think part of that starts with our perspective, doesn't it? So, if our perspective is my role here is to teach you some things,
Right.
that's very different to like that's part of my role, but also my role is to help you to explore and to help facilitate a space where you can ask questions and you can be a part of this thing. It's that whole delivering it to them or delivering it with them, isn't it? That whole
Absolutely.
perspective change and doing things differently.
Yeah, and it makes you realize how important that discipleship question is alongside this next generation question. The two, they go really hand in hand. And I think many churches would say, well, we do a kids song. Do you know what I mean? And it's like that's great, that's part of it. But what does it mean to have learning? How are we equipping and resourcing, especially with the internet? So we've talked about all the negatives of hyperconnectivity, but we now live in a world where you can curate podcasts like this one. You can get access to every bit of teaching under the sun. It's all there for you.
Yeah.
But often people don't know how to curate it and pull it together. So how do churches, for example, when was the last time you saw a church that when you join the church, you say, here's a playlist on Spotify of recommended songs to listen to, but also podcasts to listen to? Because if you want to know, like if you're a new believer, if you want to know, here's how you can do it. How do we point people to effective resources online beyond just the Alpha course? How do we use then technology to connect people in groups beyond just WhatsApp groups? There are so many questions that the world is asking right now. They know how to build community. They know how to build around common cause. And we often get stuck in this mentality of like, we have to keep the wheels turning of that religious activity. So there's a lot of work to do, but it's exciting, isn't it? And I believe the hope of Gen Alpha is that I believe that they'll get a hold of this, and that if we can get out of the way and serve them and love them and lead them well, that they can make, like, what's church going to look like in 2050?
Yeah.
For those Gen Beta kids that have grown up, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's exciting. Dave, what is the name of the book and when does it come out? Where can people buy it?
So the book is called Raising Gen Alpha, Helping Kids Navigate Everything from Anxiety to AI. And it comes out at the end of April. So you can find it wherever books are sold. So if you Google Raising Gen Alpha or my name, Dave Boden, Boden, you'll be able to find the book. Wherever books are sold, you can get it on Amazon, you can get it on Eden, you can get it on 10 of those. If you want to do bulk copies, like for your church, 10 of those is always really, really good. 10ofthose.com. It's great for that.
Oh, yeah. So if people wanted to buy it for their team or...
Exactly, yeah.
whatever.
And the beauty is I'm not doing it as a money maker. I'm doing it because I'm so blessed to have a day job. I'm doing it to be able to get the message out there. So as much as people can share about it or talk about it, it's so appreciated.
Yeah, we're reviewing it as one of our resources for youth and kids leaders and parents. So we'll post it as well on our social media stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah. Last question. What advice, encouragement would you give for the youth and kids leaders listening?
Two very quick things. Number one, your influence matters way more than you imagine. I've been in working with young people since I was 16. So I talked to you earlier about my own journey between 10 and 14. It'd been really tough. From the age of 16, I was starting to work on rough estates in Leicestershire to reach the next generation. And I think sometimes we forget our influence matters more than you think. And the other thing is just don't give up. Like sometimes you just got to keep going. And it's not that you keep doing the same thing, but you've got to keep consistent and keep going. So I would say to everybody that is out there, because it's tough at the moment, and we're grateful for resources like what you're doing, Becky, and with the team of bringing people together and helping to kind of equip people. But don't give up, because the Bible says, let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due season we'll reap. So there is a harvest coming, and sometimes you just got to hang in there till it happens.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much. Pleasure to talk to you today, Dave. We wish you all the best with the new book. We're praying that it helps and supports a lot of people. Thank you to all of our listeners today for tuning in. Hope you found this episode useful and inspiring. And we're cheering you on in all you do for kids and youth work and in your faith journey. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe this episode. You can find Youth Work Plus on all the social channels, and do contact us. We'd love to hear from you and connect with you. And be able to support you further if that's what you want and need. But yeah, apart from that, we'll catch you on the next one. So it's a bye from me and it's a bye from Dave.
Goodbye. Thanks, guys.
Bye. See you soon. Bye.